One murder, 4 defendants, and 4 very different outcomes. In July of 2016, 50-year-old Craig Rideout was killed inside his own home in Penfield, New York. The next morning, his body was found roughly an hour away, wrapped in a tarp and abandoned in the woods. Someone had poured a corrosive chemical over his face and hands after he died. Investigators didn't have to look far for suspects. They arrested Craig's estranged wife, 2 of his own sons, and the man his wife was dating. All 4 would eventually sit beside each other in the same courtroom, accused of taking part in the same crime. But when the verdicts came back, the jury didn't see them as equally responsible. 2 were convicted of murder. 1 was convicted only of helping cover it up. And 1 walked out of the courthouse completely free. I'm Aaron, and this is the murder of Craig Rideout, a case about a bitter family breakdown, a custody fight, and a crime where the jury decided who was guilty, but never had to answer one surprisingly difficult question. Who actually killed Craig Rideout? Before we begin, this case involves murder and the deliberate disfigurement of a body after death. We'll discuss what the evidence established without dwelling unnecessarily on the graphic details. Let's go back to Penfield, New York, in the summer of 2016. The formal case name tells you almost everything about how prosecutors saw this from the start. The state of New York versus Laura Rideout, Colin Rideout, Alexander Rideout, and Paul Tucci. 1 killing, 4 defendants, 1 trial. Craig Wallace Rideout was 50 years old. He'd worked as a senior technical specialist and analyst programmer at Federated Clover Investment Advisors since 1989, almost 3 decades at the same company. He and his wife, Laura, had 7 children together. By the summer of 2016, the marriage existed on paper only. Laura had left Craig back in 2014 and started a relationship with a man called Paul Tucci. 2 of the couple's children mattered most to what was about to happen: Colin, their eldest son, and Alexander, a few years younger. What followed the separation was a divorce and custody fight that a friend of Craig's, David Higbee, would later describe in blunt terms: particularly acrimonious. Craig had been granted primary physical custody of the 2 youngest of the 7 children. Laura and Paul Tucci wanted to relocate with the kids to North Carolina. Craig opposed it. That single unresolved fight, who would raise the youngest children and where, is what prosecutors tied the killing to. Public reporting reviewed here also does not identify any earlier documented domestic violence complaint or protective order between Craig and Laura before that summer. It wasn't only Laura and Craig at odds. In the days before July 19, 2016, Colin Rideout sent his father an angry email accusing him of threats of lies and abuse. Colin would later walk back part of that himself, admitting he had never actually witnessed any type of physical abuse from his father. Others who knew Craig described him in strikingly different terms. Friends and family elsewhere called him a gentle and devoted father. Then the physical preparations began. On July 18, 2016, Colin Rideout bought drain cleaner at Walmart at Macedon. The next day, he went back to a Walmart and bought a shovel and a pair of work gloves. That same day, across town, Laura Rideout and Paul Tucci were caught on surveillance video at a different Walmart on Hudson Avenue, buying a 24-foot tarp, bungee cords, bug repellent, and a Diet Coke. None of that by itself proves anything. People buy shovels and tarps every day, but investigators would later match every one of those items to what turned up at the crime scene. And they'd later point out how the 2 shopping trips lined up, not just in time, but in place. Colin at a Walmart in Macedon, Laura and Tucci at a Walmart in Hudson Avenue, hours apart on the same day. Two separate errands run by two different sets of family members that turned out to be pieces of the same preparation. Prosecutors presented the drain cleaner in particular as part of an attempt to disfigure Craig's face and make identification more difficult. The tarp and bungee cords were a narrower piece of the puzzle. They tied Laura and Tucci to buying the material, not necessarily to carrying it, wrapping it around the body, or driving it out to Yates County. Purchasing the tools and using them were two different acts. And this particular piece of evidence only spoke directly to the first one. July 19th, 2016 was the last day anyone saw Craig Rideout alive. Sometime that night, in the basement of the Penfield townhouse, Craig was killed. The Monroe County medical examiner, Dr. Nadia Granger, determined the cause of death was strangulation, with blunt force injuries as well. At trial, she described a ligature mark running the full circumference of his neck, facial fractures, and signs of a struggle. Court records unsealed later confirmed injuries consistent with that cause of death, including a fractured hyoid bone, the small bone in the throat frequently broken in strangulation deaths, along with other blunt force trauma. In the basement, investigators recovered a homemade garrote, built from the same kind of paracord that was separately found in Alexander Rideout's bedroom. That match told investigators where the garrote likely came from. It did not tell them whose hands had tied it or used it. Investigators identified the basement as the primary crime scene, a conclusion drawn from what was down there afterward. Blood on the floor tested positive in a preliminary chemical screening for blood. Blood was also found on cardboard storage containers and wooden shelving. Blood-stained clothing, sweatpants, and the interior of a shoe and a glove matched Craig's DNA. And upstairs, in the bedroom shared by Laura and Paul Tucci, investigators found something almost mundane by comparison: Craig's television remote. By the next morning, Craig's body was in a wooded area in the town of Jerusalem, a neighboring county, Yates, about 50 feet off Adams Road, wrapped in that 24-foot tarp and sealed with bungee cords. A corrosive chemical had been applied to his face and his hands after death. Dr. Granger's testimony described the damage as severe enough to blacken the skin and expose the bone underneath. In the end, Craig wasn't identified by his face at all. It was his dental records who confirmed that's who he was. Near the body, investigators found a shovel matching the one purchased at that Macedon Walmart the day before, along with work gloves reported to carry Craig's blood. Neither item on its own proved who had actually dug up the ground or wrapped the tarp, only that the tools had been used, and they could be traced back to specific purchases on a specific day by specific people. Witnesses later told investigators they had seen two vehicles parked along that same stretch of road, around 5 that morning. No one has ever established who was in them. Now, one detail worth flagging here, because it shows up differently across the reporting on this case. Most contemporaneous accounts, including the indictment coverage and Craig's own published obituary, agree that he was last seen alive on July 19th and found dead the next day, July 20th. A later article, written years afterward, described that gap differently, saying he was found 2 days after he disappeared. The weight of the earlier, more consistent reporting points to a 1-day gap, and that's the version this story follows. There was a second vehicle to account for too, Craig's own minivan, found abandoned in a park and ride lot of Interstate 490 outside Rochester. Left there, investigators believe, to suggest Craig had simply driven off somewhere on his own. What's notable about the first stage of this investigation is how careful it was. Investigators didn't leap straight to a murder charge. Reporting from that week said so directly. No one has been charged with killing Rideout. What they had instead was enough to charge 3 people, Laura, Colin, and Alexander Rideout, with a lesser offense, tampering with physical evidence. Some of that evidence came from Mendon Ponds Park, where investigators caught Alexander Rideout trying to dispose of a bag containing blood-stained clothing and other items connected to Craig. A search of the Penfield basement turned up the garage and the rest of the physical evidence already described. Behind the scenes, the Monroe County Sheriff's Office and the New York State Police spent months building up the case. According to lead prosecutor Tim Prosperi, 4 months after those first tampering charges, on December 2nd, 2016, a Monroe County grand jury indicted all 4. Laura Rideout, Colin Rideout, that at that point he would be 22 by one account or 23 by another, Alexander Rideout, and Paul Tucci on second-degree murder under New York's penal law, along with tampering with physical evidence. Laura was additionally indicted for second-degree burglary. What started as a tampering case against 3 family members was now a murder case against 4 people: the victim's estranged wife, both of his sons, and his wife's boyfriend. The defense argued that a joint trial could unfairly combine the evidence against all 4 defendants. Judge Moran denied severance, and all 4 proceeded in a single joint trial. Jury selection began on June 20th, 2017, with opening statements 3 days later, delivered by prosecutors Tim Prosperi and James Egan before Justice Thomas E. Moran of Monroe County Supreme Court. Over the following weeks, the jury heard from more than 50 witnesses and reviewed more than 600 pieces of evidence. Dr. Granger returned to testify to the cause of death and the extent of those injuries. Prosecutors laid out their theory plainly, that the killing was tied to the custody fight, that Laura wanted Craig out of the way of her plan to relocate to North Carolina with the children, and that her sons and her boyfriend had each played some part in what happened, or in covering it up afterward. That was the argument. What the jury had to decide was how far the evidence actually carried it, and whether it carried the same distance for all 4 defendants or not. It didn't carry the same distance. After more than 4 days of deliberation, the jury returned its verdicts on July 25th, 2017, and the differences between them turned out to be the most revealing part of the entire case. Laura Rideout, guilty of second-degree murder, guilty of tampering with evidence, guilty of second-degree burglary. Colin Rideout, guilty of second-degree murder, guilty of 2 counts of tampering with evidence. Alexander Rideout, not guilty of murder, but guilty of 2 counts of tampering with evidence. Paul Tucci, not guilty of everything. 2 convictions for murder, 1 conviction for helping cover it up, but not for the killing itself, and 1 full acquittal. 4 defendants tried in the same courtroom on the same evidence walked out with 4 different outcomes. A juror who spoke to reporters afterward helped explain that split. Asked about Paul Tucci specifically, the juror said the panel believed he probably knew about the killing, but added there's just no way we could prove that. That's about as clean a line as you'll find between suspicion and proof. The jury may have believed something about Tucci that they weren't willing to convict him on. The same juror pointed to what they described as sloppy evidence handling at the arrest scene that potentially contaminated DNA samples, though that's one juror's personal impression, not a finding by any court or investigative body. And the juror mentioned something else, that prosecutors never actually produced what the juror called the iron weapon used to strike the victim. Whether such a weapon was ever recovered or simply referenced without being introduced as evidence isn't something the record settles. Monroe County Sheriff Patrick O'Flynn would later call this one of the most severe cases of his career. Paul Tucci, the one defendant the jury cleared entirely, spoke to reporters afterward. It just didn't feel real, he said. Of the 4 people who had sat at that defense table for weeks, he was the only one who walked out of that courthouse that day a free man. Whether trying all 4 defendants together in one courtroom made it easier or harder for the jury to sort out each person's individual role is impossible to say with certainty from this record alone, but it's worth noticing that the same jury that convicted 2 family members of murder convicted a third of only helping cover it up, and acquitted a 4th entirely. Sat through the same body of more than 600 pieces of evidence to reach 4 different conclusions. That alone suggests they weren't treating the 4 defendants as one unit. Whatever the joint trial did or didn't do to their thinking, they still drew distinctions between the people sitting at that defense table. The day after the verdict, sealed court papers were made public, revealing some of what the jury never heard. In an interview with sheriff's deputies, Colin Rideout reportedly admitted to helping clean up blood and dispose of bags, and said his mother had instructed him to buy the shovel and the cleaning supplies. That statement never reached the jury. Colin hadn't been read his Miranda rights before he gave it. The papers also referenced a phone search for involuntary manslaughter and text messages among the siblings discussing plans to falsely accuse their father, but investigators couldn't establish who had used the phone or written the messages, so neither reached the jury either. All of it remained material investigators had found, not evidence a jury was ever asked to weigh. It's worth being clear about what these gaps tell us and what they don't. The juror's comment about sloppy evidence handling is one person's personal impression, not a finding by any court, and the Miranda violation that got Colin's statement thrown out is a suppression ruling about how that evidence could be used at trial. It did not by itself establish broader investigative misconduct. Sentencing was originally expected on September 1st, 2017. It ended up happening about 6 weeks later, on October 13th, 2017. Judge Moran did not soften the moment. He told the courtroom the community should be horrified about the manner he was killed and the manner he was disposed of. In remarks reported from that same hearing, he also called what happened premeditated, evil, and diabolical. Laura Rideout received 25 years to life for the murder alone. On top of that, the judge added a consecutive 15 years for burglary and a consecutive 1 1/3 to 4 years for tampering with evidence. Each sentence stacked on top of the last, rather than served at the same time. Together, those consecutive sentences amounted to 41 1/3 years to life. Colin Rideout received that same 25 years to life term for murder, plus consecutive tampering sentences. Years later, when Colin's case reached the appellate court, the judges confirmed his combined sentence in exact terms: 27 2/3 years to a life. Alexander Rideout, convicted of only the 2 tampering counts, received consecutive sentences with a maximum of 8 years. The reported minimum varied slightly from one outlet to the next, but the 8-year ceiling was consistent across the reporting. None of the 3 convicted defendants let the verdict stand without a fight. Lara Rideout appealed first. On November 15, 2019, New York's Appellate Division, 4th Department unanimously upheld both her conviction and her sentence, rejecting her arguments about insufficient evidence, lack of motive, and unfair joint trial. The court pointed to the video-documented Walmart purchases, the blood on the clothing, and the items recovered inside the house, and the fact that Laura had been seen cleaning the townhouse the day after the killing. Their decision included a line worth understanding, because it explains how a case built almost entirely on circumstantial evidence can still hold up. Intent to kill may be inferred from defendant's conduct as well as the circumstances surrounding the crime. In plain terms, prosecutors didn't need a confession or an eyewitness. A jury could look at everything Laura did before and after the killing and reasonably conclude that what she intended. New York's Court of Appeals declined to hear any further appeal, according to reporting from May 2020. In September of 2021, Judge Moran denied a further motion to void her verdict based on a Supreme Court ruling about non-unanimous juries. And in June 2022, the Fourth Department denied one more attempt, a writ of error coram nobis. No later ruling has overturned her conviction. Alexander Rideout's appeal took longer to reach a decision, but landed the same way. On September 27, 2024, the Fourth Department unanimously affirmed his tampering convictions, rejecting his arguments about insufficient notice and insufficient evidence. Colin Rideout's appeal was decided less than 2 months later. On November 15, 2024, the court affirmed everything: the murder conviction, the tampering conviction, and the 27 2/3 years to life sentence, rejecting his claims that the evidence was too thin, the joint trial with 3 co-defendants unfair, and that the sentence was too harsh. On the joint trial question, the court found the evidence against the family members so intertwined, identical evidence in its own words, that trying them together hadn't been unfair. Alexander's path out of prison had started well before that ruling. He was denied parole in March 2019. The parole board found he had not fully processed the magnitude of his crime. 2 years later, in March 2021, the board reversed course and granted him parole. He walked out of Mid-State Correctional Facility on March 30th, 2021, after roughly 3.5 years behind bars. At the time of his release, his parole supervision was reported to run until July 15th, 2025. Sources reviewed for this video don't establish what happened after that date. In the years since his conviction, Colin Rideout has given his own account of what happened, telling one interviewer that his mother had, in his words, set him up, and that his actual role was limited to helping clean up after the killing, not carrying it out. He also said his attorney advised him not to testify at trial. That public account lines up closely with the statement he reportedly gave sheriff's deputies back in 2016, that he cleaned up blood, disposed of bags, and did it because his mother told him to. It's worth being precise about what both versions of that claim are and what they aren't. Neither has ever been accepted in court. The deputy's statement was thrown out before trial on Miranda grounds, and that jury, they did not accept a cleanup-only account as the full extent of Colin's role. It convicted him on second-degree murder in addition to 2 counts of tampering with evidence. As of the most recent reporting reviewed, Laura Rideout and Colin Rideout both remain incarcerated, each serving an indeterminate sentence. The kind with a minimum number of years that must pass before parole can even be considered, and no fixed release date beyond that. For both of them, that minimum is measured in decades. Neither has a confirmed parole date on the record. Alexander Rideout has been free on parole since March 2021. Paul Tucci, fully acquitted, has faced no further charges connected to Craig's death. Craig and Laura Rideout had 7 children together. By the time this case had worked its way through a jury verdict, a sentence hearing, and years of appeals, 4 of those 7 children had both parents effectively removed from ordinary family life. Their mother convicted of killing their father, one brother convicted alongside her, and another brother who had already spent more than 3 years in prison himself before being paroled for his part in the cover-up. Whatever happened in that basement in July of 2016, it's costed an end with Craig. Where those 7 children have landed since, how they've divided their loyalties, whether they've stayed in touch with their mother and brothers at all, none of that is part of the public record. Craig's sister, Robin Drew, spoke publicly after the verdict. "There has been some justice for my brother," she said. She also reflected on the limits of what any trial could actually give the family back. "We'll never get him back, but we have some answers. I'm very sorry for my mom and the other parents." There's one specific piece of uncertainty this case leaves behind, and it's worth naming precisely because it isn't the same thing as saying the case went unsolved. A jury found Laura and Colin guilty of murder. It found Alexander guilty only of tampering, and it acquitted Paul Tucci entirely. What that split verdict does not settle, and under New York law it was never required to settle, is exactly who did what inside that basement. Whose hands were on the garage? Who struck the blows Dr. Granger described? The Fourth Department's own 2019 ruling acknowledged as much. Prosecutors only had to prove that Laura and Colin acted together with the intent to kill, not assign a precise physical role to each of them. It's worth pausing on the shape of this case as a whole before we close it out. The killing itself, the purchases, the death in the basement, the drive to Yates County, the acid, the disposal, happened inside a window of roughly 24 to 48 hours. Everything that came after it stretched on for 8 years. Tampering charges in 2016, a murder indictment that December, a trial the following summer, sentencing that fall, and then a slow procession of appellate rulings running from 2019 all the way to late 2024. A crime that took a day or two to commit took the better part of a decade to finish moving through the courts. So the case closes on that note. A verdict from July 2017, sentences handed down that October, then that string of appellate and post-conviction rulings for Laura in 2019, 2021, and 2022, for her sons in 2024, and not one of them overturned the jury's convictions. In one question those courts were never built to answer. Colin Rideout still says his mother is the one truly responsible. Both accounts now exist in the public record. The jury convicted him of second-degree murder, and no later court ruling has overturned that conviction. And that's where we leave this case. 4 people went into the same courtroom accused of participating in Craig Rideout's murder. The jury convicted Laura and Colin of murder. It decided Alexander helped cover the crime up, but didn't kill his father. And when it came to Paul Tucci, the jury decided suspicion simply wasn't enough. Those verdicts have survived years of appeals. But there's one thing neither that jury nor the courts that came afterward ever had to determine. Whose hands actually killed Craig Rideout? Legally, that question doesn't change the verdict. Laura and Colin could act together with the intent to kill without prosecutors proving which one physically carried out each part of the murder. But it leaves this case in an unusual place. We know who the law holds responsible. We still don't know exactly what each of them did. Some questions have answers. Others may never get them. But here, we'll always try to separate what we know from what we think we know. I'm Aaron. Thanks for watching. If there's a case you think deserves this kind of examination, tell us about it below in the comments. And if you want more deep dives like this one, subscribe. I'll see you in the next case.